here run a business, like a research business? Just so we see how much experience we have in that regard. Who has ever run a business for research, whether it was successful or not? That's fine.
You can raise your hands. There's one hand. There's a clap. Two hands. Three. Four. You're muted now. Okay, wait a minute, just a second.
Can you hear me?
Sorry.
I'm looking. Can you hear me?
You may speak, Prof.
Okay, so you can hear me, right? Okay, I'm very cool. Can you guys hear me? Give me a thumbs up if you can hear me, please. Okay, all right, awesome. Okay, so today's session we'll just talk about in general the business of science. And so we just cover three things. What am I going to sell? Obviously, if you're not a business, if you're not making revenue, if you open a shop and you say you're in business and you're not making money, well, then that means it's just a hobby. So, but the biggest question, well, when anyone wants to start a business, especially the business of research, is what am I going to sell? And that's often a very tough question because we tend to undervalue the extent of our skill sets, right? We tend to have maybe imposter syndrome, or we have a little we're a little lacking in the area of confidence in terms of, can I pull this off? And so the initial thoughts might be, okay, what do I even know about this area that anyone will want to come and pay their hard-earned money to, buy my services or my goods, as the case might be. So it becomes very critical to figure out, what am I going to sell? That's a very good question. Then who am I going to sell it to? And then how do I find clients? And so I'll cover those, and then we'll talk about some resources. I'll share some resources that might be helpful for those of you who might be thinking of that. So those resources cover areas like registering and finding clients and a whole bunch of other things. All right, so let's start with the first question. What am I going to sell? Now, a better way to frame that question will be, what problem am I going to solve? Because the reality is that for you to make money in any business, two conditions have to be met. One, you must be solving a problem. And number two, there must be money in that problem, right? If you're not solving a problem, if all you're doing is just doing some activity that's more of things you love to do, but are not really solving the problem, well, then how do you expect anyone to pay money for that, right? So you must be solving a real problem. And we define problems by two parameters. Number one, how severe is it? And how many people are affected by it? So if it's a very common problem that is very severe, that affects a whole lot of people, well, that's a great problem to address. And of course, you don't want to go into businesses or solve problems that have a purely humanitarian angle, because that's no longer a business. That's now charity. So the problem must be significant and substantial, and there has to be money in the problem. Once you start on a business, you realize very soon that there's no shortage of people who love free things. And so that becomes very important for you to figure out how you're going to sell this. Then that emphasizes why it has to be a problem. So defining the problem is very, very first step. Now, since we're talking about the business of research, it's very easy for us to just imagine that, well, then this must involve writing a manuscript and doing analysis and maybe medical writing. Well, sure, those are also part of business of the research process, but you want to think very broad in terms of the scope of a problem. So think of the entire spectrum of the research process from the very beginning to the very end, and think of the things that are pain points, right? Like right now, there are things I just wished somebody would solve, that I'll pay top dollar for, because there are things that I hate to do, which I have to do, right? In the scientific process. So let's look at the scientific journey, for example. You want to start let's say you're doing work for an international study. You start research project, you meet collaborators. Now you have to do IRB. If you've ever done an international study, you realize how much of a pain that is. You have to get IRB from all the countries. Of course, there's no such thing as a centralized IRB where you have approval. Approved by one means approved by all. Imagine how much of a pain, just a pain relief that would be if somebody created a platform or a consortium or whatever you call it that solved that problem. So that researchers who have to do international studies, which is a very common thing, don't have to go and start looking for, do I know somebody in Poland, or do I know somebody in Canada, or do I know somebody in Saudi? No, they don't need to do that, because you have already solved that problem by bringing stakeholders together. So see, that's how you want to solve problems from the systems level. Because the reality is, if you want to, again, this is a function of question number 2, right? Who am I going to sell to? If you the scope of the clientele will fall into 2. Either it is primarily a business solution, or a business to customer or consumer, right? So talk about B2B solutions or B2C. Well, if you're targeting business solutions, which are more sustainable, then you really want to shift from end product to systems behind those products. So in this case, it's not just about getting you an IRB certificate. It's about providing the system for that problem, right? And so that's just one problem. Then think of other areas in the research process. Okay, you've gotten an IRB, but then in some areas where you have to collect data, let's say you go to some low-income country where they already have paper records. It's easy if you're collecting data from scratch. It's easy to just collect the data into so many platforms and analyze it in real time. But what of environments or settings where they already had paper forms that were not necessarily formatted for research? That's a huge problem that still exists. So imagine somebody solved that problem for us by creating a system, a platform that takes data. And now in the age of AI, there's so many tools or technologies that you can harness to solve those, and allows for real-time synthesis of such data, and either converting it from an unstructured format to a structured format, or synthesizing it in its native unstructured format, right? That is a huge problem that still plagues researchers around the world, because we've had historical data that has just existed on paper forms, right? And then think of other things, systems that I personally wish somebody would build, because I just don't have the bandwidth. Platform for meta-analysis. I would, that is a problem that still plagues researchers. Just think of how many hours it takes, the length of time and the pain it takes to do meta-analysis. The burden in terms of person hours is amazing. And if there was ever any solution that was begging to be utilized for AI, or that AI was a perfect match for, it is a platform for meta-analysis, right? And so you can also look around, you see solutions that have been built but do not necessarily solve the problem, right? So I think it's moving past just thinking of some very well-defined end product, like, oh, I want to write a manuscript, I want to be doing analysis for people, to thinking in terms of systems and how do we create systems. So it's a shift from moving beyond a product, like a final product, to the systems that produce those final products. And then again, you can also think broader in terms of pain points that come in the process. As a researcher, you have adjacent skills that come as a consequence of the precision that science requires. And that opens up a lot of other research areas or other business areas that you might not necessarily be thinking about. Think of areas like QA engineering, like quality assurance, right? Well, you may not necessarily be formally trained as a QA engineer or a QA person, but that's an adjacent area that you could branch into. And there's just so many startups that are funded, and they less than 25%, rough estimate of startups have a dedicated QA. That solves the problem of how will I find clients. If you say a startup that has built a product, well, go to their platform, do a thorough QA, send them comments. Hey, I found these issues on the platform. Do that over and over. That's how you get clients, right? When they see the value you bring. So the point I'm trying to make is that the business of science goes beyond just, oh, I'm going to have analysis. I'm going to analyze data or write manuscripts, because that's what instinctively comes to our minds when we think of research, because we're hardwired to write papers or hardwired to do analysis, but it's much broader than that. And it goes to thinking of, systems, moving beyond just final products to systems. So that's sort of the problem of what am I going to sell? It has to be an endeavor where you're solving a problem. And remember, I said there are two benchmarks that would qualify whether that problem makes sense from a business perspective. One, it has to be a problem, a real problem. All too often, you have solutions that are looking for a problem. That doesn't make sense. You need to have problems, actual problems that people face in the real world. And of course, there has to be money in the problem. Then, who am I going to sell to? Well, like we said, there are two ways to look at that. You will have a business-to-business perspective where you are designing primarily for businesses. Of course, that doesn't mean that individual consumers can use, but it means your primary target is businesses. The beauty of having a business-to-business model is that it's very sustainable. You don't need a whole lot of clients to make a whole lot of money. If your product or your service is targeted at individuals, or let's say you are targeting master's students to write their thesis for them, or something of that nature, well, you're going to be in for a lot of work and for very little money, right? For a very long time, because, well, they don't have money to pay you, right? So it's always, if you can, it's always better to think in terms of how do I service businesses as opposed to individuals, because, well, individuals, especially if they are lower on the earning spectrum, well, they don't have money. So that's something you want to think. But of course, as you think towards B2B, the problem has to be substantial in a way that that makes it appealing. And then you can also think of technology. And I know that's not something that we may be hardwired to think about. We might think of just services. Okay, I want to offer my services. I do medical writing or I do analysis. But if we're going to have systems thinking, then that means that we need to, at some level, start thinking about technology or products, right? That's what we're talking about SaaS, software as a service or research as a service or science as a service or whatever service you want to provide in that product, right? And you don't have to build the final products, at once. You can start small, right? That's what we talk about, the concept of an MVP, a minimum viable product. It's viable because it works. So think of any problem you're solving. So let's say you are trying to solve the problem of IRBs, for example. You want to say, okay, I'm going to build a global consortium for IRB approval. Well, you don't have to start with all the countries in the world. You can start with, let's say, a small area. Let's say your country. You can say, okay, I'm going to have partnerships. How's the business model going to work? How will the approvals get in? How would we have cross approval for systems, right? What do we need a platform? Of course, what kind of platform will it be? So that way, that's how you start, right? And then you can grow. So a minimum viable product is very important because it helps you to test whether the idea makes sense. Because initially, of course, when you come up with an idea, you're excited about it and you just want to go off and build it. An MVP allows you to see whether it has whether there's fit, right? There has to be a good fit between the market and the product. You might have a great product, but there may be no market for it. That's what we're talking about, product market fit, which means that your product has a good fit with the market, right? We also talk about the founder product fit, meaning that you, the founder, should be a good fit with the product. you have no business trying to build a platform or any solution that you're not an expert in, because it's not going to solve any problem. In fact, you will end up being the problem because it ends up being a whole layer of confusion. So ensuring that you know enough, you have significant depth in that area to solve a problem in a way that inspires confidence of users, and ensuring also that there is product market fit. And that's where an MVP helps you, so that you can do that. Now, there are lots of websites that allow you, you might say, oh, I don't have money. Well, there are lots of websites that allow you, you can actually look for founders. So in the event you don't have you have a great idea, you want to build a product, there are dozens of platforms where you can sign up to be a co-founder. We can say, well, I want to build a product, but I'm not a technical person. I just have an idea. I'm looking for a co-founder, right? As sometimes we underestimate how hard it is to have a good idea. Now, an idea itself is worthless, right? We say ideas are what, a dime a dozen, because an idea itself is useless. So you don't want to get into this space where you're like, oh, I'm going to protect my idea. I'm not going to tell anybody. Well, that's something that, I find quite comical, because people act as though the idea is this golden thing. There's a reason why you cannot patent an idea, because ideas are worthless in of themselves. But having a great idea is a solid start. Not everyone has your expertise in an area, whether it's research or whatever it is, gives you a very solid vantage point to see things that most people cannot see. So it's still a very solid, asset. But if you're not technical, for example, the idea it won't build itself. Like we say, the roads can't build themselves or won't build themselves. So you need somebody, a technical person. And it doesn't have to be a huge team. It can just be two people, two of you. You have you the expert in that area, and you have a technical person who hopefully has expertise across the whole stack, at least front end, back end, and some degree of data science. And the two of you can build an MVP that works. So this is it's a good place to start if you have a good idea, to say, okay, I don't have money, but we will build, and if it's successful, we will be co-founders and we'll share the whatever comes as revenue. So that's a great way to do that. So there are lots of sites like that. One of the things that I also look forward to doing is looking for individuals who have like brilliant ideas, who need and who need maybe a little bit of seed funding or a little bit of mentorship to be able to grow that idea. I think that's a very good way to give back to the community and help people to achieve their dreams as well, But of course, the problem is I never have that kind of time and availability. But you can always look for founders, in other spaces, and form a partnership. So that's one resource you could look for. Now, if you're trying to offer, sorry, let me put my phone on mute. If you're trying to offer services, just a sec. All right, so this is a good place to look out for. I also have some resources here that, maybe of use depending on where you sit. But this is a good place for you to start in terms of, what am I selling? You have to describe what you're selling. I have to describe it in terms of codes too. We have a North American industry classification system that assigns codes to whatever service you're selling, like what industry you work in. So the minimum information you need is to know the kind of industry you're working in, what kind of services you're delivering. So because that will be required on so many forms, especially if you're delivering work for the government. So first of all, familiarize yourself with what you're trying to solve and how it's codified. So for example, if you're looking at, let's say, analysis, so there are different types of analysis, right? So you can't just say, oh, I offer services and analysis. Like, what does that even mean? So you'll have there are very specific codes for very specific things. So the point is that you need to, whatever area, once you've zoned in on an area, you need to make sure that you understand everything about it, that you have some documentation, right? Have documentation for what you're trying to do. That way you can, if you're even trying to create a website, that gives you the baseline to develop on, right? So this is a great place to start from. Understand the environment in which you're working in. There are lots of sites that also offer you services. So the fact that you are trying to the fact that you're trying to start a business doesn't mean that you need to know everything about it. So let's say you just want to offer services, let's say research services or analysis or some other services, right? And you're like, oh, geez, but I don't know how to do this. Well, there are many platforms that could allow you to find, you know, gig workers, right? So you could search, oh, I want somebody to do this. So that's one resource that you could use. And the beauty of this is that you can also use services from here to make your proposals to bigger companies more appealing. When I started building a CRO, contract research organization, I always had minimum standards for how I wanted proposals to look like. So, for example, this is a standard proposal, for example, that had formatting requirements. So you want to, when you share a document with a client, to say, wow, okay, this looks really professional, right? So it's not just you just grabbing some Word document. The proposal itself should make the person want to read it. So a platform like Fiverr allows you can get things like this done for, it's called Fiverr because it's from $5. So you can get things like this done for cheap. So Fiverr is a great resource for you if you either you are looking for a middle person who will do the work, or you're just looking for services to buy for your own business so that you make things look professional, especially at the early stage where you may not have you may not have any staff. Obviously, when you start at the beginning, you're just a one-man show or one-person show. So that allows you to be able to do that. So Fiverr is a great thing. The resource to know. Domain names, you need to have a domain. Don't obsess too much about, oh, what's my website going to be called, or no. That should you eventually decide on that, you need to get a domain, right? So let's say your company is called, Data Hub, for example. So you can come here and search domains, and then you can explore. You can buy one, So this is one place you can explore to for that. Now, for looking for clients, a good place to look for is also SAM. This is for the U.S. federal government, but it also has it pulls in orders for open proposals from state governments or local governments. So it's a great resource for that. Unfortunately, now in the U.S. government, state governments and local governments are being caught with funding. So that it is what it is, but that's also a resource to know. And then other things that you want to know is always if it depends on what you're trying to do, but you always want to sign up as a vendor for the companies of interest. So if, for example, you're trying to get into the pharmaceutical space, well, you have to go to their websites and sign up as a supplier or a vendor. Of course, nobody's ever going to call you just because you went and signed as a vendor, right? But to become a preferred vendor, you must first of all have signed up as a vendor. So it's the two-way process. Well, you have to sign up there, but then this is where networking comes in, right? We can't just the probability of getting to become a preferred vendor is absolutely zero if you're not even registered as a vendor in the first place. So that's one of the things that you would have to do, Now the issue of pricing for studies. So how much does how much do they cost? Well, it depends based on the work you're doing, the experience, the expertise you have. But in general, let's look at a very high level scope of how much do we cost for research studies. This is assuming that you're doing a business to business, obviously. It cannot work with a business to individual. So let's just look at some overall structure of how we cost things so that you have some idea of how it works. So this is an example of a proposal on how it looks like. You have, you have a description of the work you're going to do. You have the scope of work well defined, and so on and so forth. So let's just look at, scope of work and how that plays out in general. This is, of course, it varies from project to project, but in general, it's about the same thing. So the scope of work essentially will cover kickoff meeting. You have project management. You always define who is going to do what. Is the client going to do this, or are you the one who's going to do that? Project management, which is administration of the work. Protocol development. Protocol development is a big thing in contract research, right? We talk about the PSAP, the protocol, and the status quo analysis plan. Those are very key elements. You always want to define the number of drafts that are allowed under the contract. All right, 2 drafts, so 2 versions and 1 final. Otherwise, you're going to spend your lifetime doing revisions upon revisions upon revisions. Ethics submission, those are all standard. Data collection and preparation, statistical analysis, reporting, quality control, and all of that, right? Those are the key, so for each of those elements, it's very important to define the scope of what is covered under that contract. Failure to define a scope means that the client can just keep adding and adding and adding, right? And so that it becomes very important to define the scope and freeze that scope so that you don't just have a scope creep. And also defining what the surcharge is for when work has been has exceeded a set number of revisions. So if, for example, the contract says you can only have 2 revisions or however number of revisions, what was the charge? What's the surcharge for additional revisions? In general, you want to make that charge very extremely prohibitive to discourage the client. Some clients say, well, I don't care about that, I'm going to pay. But well, I don't want to do that work, right? So you want to define that very upfront and make it, a bit high so that the client is very discouraged from doing that, and they clearly read the work ahead of time. So those are the things that you have to define in clear details as to how the work will be done. Again, everything has to be clearly defined in terms of how many drafts are going to be covered and how we're going to do it. So project deliverables must be very clearly defined, and in terms of how many drafts I'm going to supply to you at the end of the day. The timeline has to be clearly defined, and the project fee. So in general, this is a very high level. Again, it might vary from project to project, but in general, this is consistent. And again, it depends on the size of this project. This is a relatively small study. The study was on Fabry disease, which is a rare genetic disorder, and so it's a rather small. So of course, the cost is going to vary based on the size of the study and the recruitment. So this was a study in just one single country, which was Italy. So here, but this is in general. These are the things, the fees we charge for studies. Kickoff meeting, study design. Study design means, well, I'm designing the study for you. And this is the beauty of epidemiology. It's or research. It's one of those few fields that you don't have certification, right? But so it's an open secret. Anyone can do it, but you obviously need to be an expert at what you're doing. The statistical analysis plan. The big ticket items in general for this kind of work are the protocol and the statistical analysis plan. And then at the end of the day, you have the analysis and all things related to analysis and the final report. Those are some of the big ticket items. You also have to clearly establish pass-through costs. That has to be part of the agreement. Pass-through costs, as the name implies, are costs that are going to pass from me to you. maybe costs that are associated with open access publishing. Who is paying for that? Well, that will have to be a pass-through cost, and so on and so forth, right? So in general, for an original study where you're collecting data, this would be around the range, obviously with differences, but studies are expensive to conduct. So you'll expect, most times you'd have, a couple of hundreds of thousands, depending on the scope. It's quite different again if it's a literary review or a systematic review. And of course, a lot of things will go into that, but in general, that's how studies are costed, right? So that gives an idea of what to expect in terms of how studies are costed. You don't want to go too low below the industry norm, because then the client begins to wonder why your rate so low, right? I obviously don't want to price yourself out of work too. The business of research is one that is built on credibility. Sure, you can have a website, but clients are not going to come to you because you have a website. Clients come to you because there's word of mouth that has spread that you are really, really good at what you do. And that's how clients come to you. So it's something that you want to be, you want to, I think that the two most important elements for success in the business of research are, one, a healthy level of paranoia, believing that you made a mistake and that you go back over and over and over to check, right? You can't afford to be making mistakes. It's just no. So, and you solve that by having some level of paranoia, and then consistency, right? So ensuring that you're consistent, you, as much as possible, deliver when you said you're going to deliver. Because think of it, right? If you're a new business, how do you break into a crowded space? Well, you have to do so by doing it faster, doing it maybe slightly cheaper, or doing it better. Those are the only three ways. Now, if you combine multiple of those, well, that's great. So that, for me, that was what worked for me. Like, okay, in general, it's going to take the competitor like 2 weeks, 1 month to deliver this work. Well, how about I'm going to deliver it in 3 days, right? And so that is how you start. And if you're going to do work B2B, business to business, you'll have to dedicate a healthy amount of money at the beginning to attending conferences, because that's where you're going to find, for example, if you're doing work for a farmer, you find them at conferences, like, pharmacoepic conferences, for example. And so that is something that might need to happen, because you like, how else are you going to meet clients, right? So there has to be some effort at the beginning to understand that it's not going to happen overnight, but with persistence and maybe with some luck, well, you might just have a way out of that. But again, at the very beginning, that depends on you determining what you want in terms of the scope of work. Do you want, again, B2B or B2C? And so that answers the question of who am I going to sell to, what am I going to sell, and how will I find clients? Well, finding clients is really this 2x2 matrix explains the 4 core ways you can find clients. It's either people who know you or people who do not know you, right? And then on this axis, 1-to-1 private, 1-to-1 public. So people who know you, you reach out to them 1-to-1. Well, that's warm outreach. You're like, oh, hey, do you know I just set up shop? I'm doing this. And so that's it. I think that, we should have a culture where we have, business showers. Like if we have baby showers, why can't we have business showers for businesses that are set up? It's the challenge with business, however, is that it's a very lonely road. You should expect zero support from people whom you know. So while I put this here as, it doesn't hurt to reach out to them, but do not expect anything to come from people you know, really, fundamentally. Well, I think it rarely happens that way. So don't focus too much. Don't be banking on people you know that, oh, well, I have this friend who works in this space, and so I'm going to set up this business and then no. Your best bet is people who you actually do not know, right? And so one-on-one private, people you know, warm outreach. One-on-one people who you do not know, that's cold outreach. That's, you know, you might reach out to folks on LinkedIn, but please, you know, just have some basic etiquette when you do that. Don't just send somebody a request and then immediately start, you know, bombarding them with sales. Nobody likes to be um nobody wants to be sold something to on just that very first time, right? So you want to develop relationships first, and then, you know, you make a pitch. One-to-one public, that's you post free content. Again, you don't want to sound too salesy all the time. Of course, you should talk about your product, but it's not every single time you're advertising your product. Nobody wants to read an advert. And so you should balance it out. You know, maybe 70-30, 70% of the content is just free educational content. And then, you know, you can also still talk about your product in a way that is, you know, that is balanced. And then one-to-one, and, you know, in terms of people who you do not know, that is paid ads, right? You have to make money, spend money to make money in general. So those are how you can find clients in general. The most consistent ones are these ones, you know. Social media content is quite solid, and also, you know, paid ads. Those work pretty well. And so for those who are, you know, I think in general, of course, I have a bias towards technological solutions. I think that it's in the long scheme of things, it's easier to scale it. You build a solid platform, and the cost of serving 10 users is, you know, is about the same, you know, as cost of serving 1,000, right? Of course, there may be small differences, but so that is a great way to do it. But obviously, you need to be a subject matter expert, and it's a lot of pain. So that is something you need to be there. But again, it's a trade-off, right? To offer a service to individual users, you have to be there all the time. If you're, let's say, offering analysis, well, you have to be there analyzing the data, as opposed to building the system that does that. So at the end of the day, it's up to, you know, individuals. Now you have to also be patient, and you should know that things don't just happen overnight. And this is also baked into science. Talk about the diffusion of innovation for product launches or any new thing at all. You have the initial people who will accept it will be the innovators themselves. Then you have early adopters and all of that. So it's allowing yourself to have that, you know, that expectation that things take time, but you just have to be consistent with what you do. And then if you're going to go the tech route, well, you really want to build not just an MVP, but I always talk about an MLP, not just a minimum viable product. Because we won't talk about viability, we're talking about functionality. So here the product is functional at the base, but it's not reliable, it's very buggy, it's, you know, the UI is not great and all of that. You really want to have an MLP, a minimum lovable product. It's not just that it works, people love it, right? It's functional, it's reliable, it's usable, the UI UX is great, and all of that. So that's what you want to aspire to, right? So for those who have an idea, you should think, right? I think there are big problems that I'm solving in the world. If you have a great idea and you don't know what to do, well, you can share. I'm willing to help if that idea is really groundbreaking. You know, we can help in that regard. But you can also go ahead and look for co-founders. I think that might be just the easiest way for you. So there are like hundreds of sites that offer the ability to have co-founders without you shelling out money to do something. But you must first of all have an idea that solves a problem, and then you validate it. All right, I'm going to stop here and take questions from folks, so that I just wanted it to be interactive. So if you have questions, please, you can drop them and we'll answer them accordingly. The goal is that next week we just wanted to talk about for those who are interested in the business of research, what kinds of studies must you absolutely, or what kinds of study designs or of research setups must you absolutely know that's what we're going to cover next week. But today we just want to talk about, in general, this the setup for business overall, whether it's business for research or just business overall, and just some basic things you ought to know about it. I didn't go too much into registration of businesses because that's obviously that's country specific. But let's see. For it depends on the country, right? In the US, for example, businesses are registered at the level of states. And so so it's pretty much different for different countries. So I don't want to give you information that may not be relevant to your country. In some other countries, you register at the level of the country, but you have to figure out what works for you. Now, it's always a good idea to register a company, even if you're not going to, even if you're not serious about running the business. And just register, this pastor said, chance favors a prepared mind. You might have so there are some things that if you're working with business, you absolutely need to have a company. So it's not when you need to you have a deal that is almost falling through that you now want to go and register. And sometimes some businesses are very skeptical of brand new businesses. Like, oh, you just started, So the good thing about starting or registering a business before you actually need it is that you allow time to pass, right? So you appear to have aged very well in terms of that area, as opposed to just saying, oh, our registration we just started yesterday. That kind of looks very suspicious. So you should definitely look up the registration process. And if you're obviously serious about doing it on a scale that is a bit large. All right, I'm going to take questions if they exist.
Yes, Prof. So I'll start by reading, and people can raise hands. Please raise your hands if you have any questions and you want to ask verbally. First question, can you explain a little more about billing or coming up with a cost for deliverables or services to provide?
Okay. All right. So there are two ways to do that, right? One of the things you definitely want to avoid is to charge, bill per hour, where it's like, oh, the client will say, all right, let's see, I'm going to pay you X amount of dollars per hour, and then you'll deliver, and then we'll count the number of hours, and then we'll pay you accordingly. That's a really horrible way of doing business because it penalizes those who are really good at what they do. So imagine I have this complex task and I can just finish it in 1 hour. So that by that logic, you're going to pay me 1 hour's work because I saved you time. It makes no sense, right? So you should absolutely refuse or do not go along the route of, oh, we're going to pay you on an hourly basis. So who has time to start counting hours? Like, oh, this is the number of hours I worked or that nature. That makes no sense. So so in general, the alternative is based on industry benchmarks in general. So we know how so in the CRO work, for example, an abstract or a protocol will cost, for example, $50,000, and then you now break down, okay, why is it costing $50,000, right? Well, it's because we're going to have an epidemiologist and a statistician and a medical writer and so on and so forth work on it, right? And here are their rates. You still have to justify how much time it's going to take for each of those individuals to work on their own parts, right? So you can say, for example, that it's going to take the statistician, 30 hours or 15 hours, whatever hours it's going to take. It's going to take the epidemiologist so and so hours. It's going to take the medical writer so and so hours. And their average rate per hour is this. Now, this is quite different from saying, you're just going to work and count the number of hours and I'll pay you, right? So this is a more preferred way because it's, you're a professional and there's absolutely no reason why you should be counting hours, because you set out to go and start shop or start a business, obviously to make money. So that is not the way to make money by saying, oh, well, I will just count the number of hours I've worked and then you will pay me by the number of hours. So follow industry benchmarks and then clearly indicate who is involved in that task, and then justify, in terms of how much each person is working, for each role, let's say even for, let's say, statistician, you might have the, the senior vice president for the vice president for, or the team lead for statistics review, and then you have a lead statistician work on it, right? So if you have, even for statistical work, you have two individuals working on it, then you will then collate and say, for these two individuals who are working on this task, for the statistical aspect, here's the total. And that's how you then sum it up. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you, Prof. The next question is, where can we find the ideal pricing for the different stages of research as a service?
Unfortunately, there's no place you can find it. It depends on, again, depends on who you're working with, right? If it's a business to business, that's quite different discussion entirely, as opposed to business to consumer, right? And so it's quite different. So you have to first of all determine who you're working with or who you choose to work with, and then you go from there. But it's you cannot move the pricing from one area to the other, because it cannot work. There's no individual who has enough money to be paying, that. But in general, right, the kind of studies that we personally do are very large studies. It's very hard for us to do a study that is under $1 million, really, right? So, but that's, again, we work the scale on which we develop work. It's larger studies, and so the pricing obviously will be different, and so a lot of things go into that, and so there's no fixed number that says this is how much it's going to be.
Okay, thank you. What would you advise about co-founders? I have seen a lot of people advising not to get a co-founder at random. It should be someone you know and trust. What has been your experience finding a co-founder?
Yeah, so you should stay away from people who you know too well, because then that familiarity means that no work is going to get done, and unfortunately you can't fire them. It's like, because then you fire somebody who, let's say you have your BFF from childhood or your family member, you're like, oh, let's be co-founders. So what happens when this person is failing to lift their own part of the weight, right? You can fire, you can fire them, of course, but then that creates a problem where you now have a fractured personal relationship. So the basis for selecting a co-founder should not necessarily be that, oh, we like each other. It should be that you bring complementary skill sets. So it means that if you can do what that person can do, then you don't need them as a co-founder, right? So the framework you want to evaluate is, number one, can I do it all by myself? Well, that would be great if you can, because that makes it more agile. You can make decisions. You can, move around and make decisions faster. But if you cannot, because maybe you don't have the full technical skills, then the next question is, this person I'm bringing in, should I make them a co-founder or should I make them an employee, right? Those are two options that you can go. Making them an employee means it's great, but it may not work if you don't have money, right? If you don't have a lot of money to start paying them every month like an employee, then your options may be quite limited there. Then the only option might be that, okay, I'll bring you on as a co-founder, and in return, we'll build this product together and see how it goes. Now, some of the things you want to really make sure when you bring in the co-founder is that you want to have, clauses in place for the minimum length of time that they have to be at the company to get their, whatever share of the company that you are signing, right? Because what prevents them from just coming in, taking that share and just leaving immediately. So you should have some clauses in place to protect yourself, to make sure that, well, this company of ours, for anybody to get value from it, we have to work at least 5 years together on this product. And so that would be the framework that I would, if I were you, would follow. But yeah, co-founders can make or break the company. If you bring a bad co-founder, well, that's you're really stuck with them. And it's also not enough for them to be to be really savvy at what they do. I will evaluate it based on three indicators: aptitude, which means skills, but also attitude and chemistry, right? Are we a good fit? Can we work together? You're going to be working very, very closely with this person for a very long time. Do they have good chemistry? Do they have, and so it shouldn't just be on, on whether they can write code. It should also be on, can we work together? And also, if their technical ability should also align with the kind of product you're building, right? Um, so it's one thing building a small app that you put on Apple Store or whatever. It's a different thing building an enterprise scale application, which will need to scale, right? Scalability simply means that how well does the app perform when it's two people using it, or when it's 2 million people using it, or 200 million people. The app should scale so that there's no compromise in performance or quality. So you need to understand, you need to have some minimum understanding. You may not be a tech person, but you should be able to ask good questions to say, all right, I'm bringing you as a co-founder, but what experience do you have with building enterprise level applications, or what have you built in the past, right? What's your profile on, what's your in your portfolio, right? What have you done before? And so these are some of the things you really want to evaluate for. Okay.
Okay, if I may just substitute for English,
Okay, great. Yeah,
she's
please.
having problem with her network.
Okay.
The next question say, good day, Prof. How do I take care of the fear of starting, seeing how small and medium business collapse in my country?
Well, the probability of winning if you don't start is zero, right? So you have to start. And you don't even need anything fancy. You can just say, hey, I'm registered for business, or and post something on LinkedIn, right? At least that takes that fear out of you. The biggest fear is the fear that, geez, who am I? Like, we have a very condescending view of ourselves. We think that, oh, wow, what do I know that anybody would come and seek my services? Well, you never know. You can't know until you try. So if you have a solid business, well, you can come and pitch to me, for example. If of course, if it solves the problem for me, I will buy your services, right? So at least you have one client that builds your confidence, and then you can say, okay, how then do I scale? So it's always finding that first client that um the problem I think with people start new businesses is it's just that lack of grit and lack of consistency. I cannot count the number of small businesses I'm like, okay, let's see how we can do, but it's like they're just never after that first meeting, they're never to be found. Talk less of the work, right? So I think people underestimate how hard it is. And I can assure you that if you're going to business with the idea that, well, I want to be my own boss, I want to do what I want to do, that's very wrong. You can't be more mistaken, because now instead of having one boss, you have 1 million bosses or 100,000 bosses, right? In terms of your clients, and you can't just work the hours you want because it's impossible. So you have to be there. Of course, you need to have gifts in terms of talent, but more importantly, you need a lot of grit and staying power. Otherwise, yeah, you'll definitely burn out.
Okay, it appears we have a hand up. Kadir, follow Ronshaw, please, if you can unmute and ask a question. Kadir, if you can please unmute to ask your question. Okay, I will just read some of the questions. Another question here says, What is the minimum number of people or staff you should have to have a research company?
One, yourself. A lot of things, one of the things you realize in life is that everything in life is more about perception. Like how the world views you is like how will people know you have only one employee? You are the only one. Like, so avoid doing some things, right? If you have a website, please don't go and put on the website your picture. That is a no-no, right? Don't do that. It just looks very tacky and looks very amateurish. So those are, or people will write, oh, principal investigator, or principal, or a million ways they write that, right? You can be a one-man company that acts like a big company. So avoid some of those mistakes. And then invest. It costs you just $7 to get a professional Gmail account. $7. I can't remember how much it costs now, but I think it's around that price range, right? So you have a professional account. So instead of saying Jimmy at gmail.com, you have Jimmy at your domain. That looks more professional, right? So you can be a one-man show, but still act like a big company. And then, if you also want to look bigger, you can create, the good thing about Gmail, the Gmail aliases, it allows you to create, aliases. So you can have a separate email for different departments of yours. Sure, you're the only one running all those departments, but you have different emails for them. And that creates the impression that you're a big company, right? The point I'm trying to make is that we control the narrative of how we are. All clients want is that you solve a problem. I couldn't care less whether it's a one-man army or a 10, like, can you solve a problem or not? So bottom line is that, yeah, you just need one person, that's yourself, to run the company.
Okay, thank you very much. There's another question, I think it's similar. What can be used as business address for registration, even if you are just registering a loan and not starting immediately?
Okay, that's a good question. You can use, I'm not sure which country you're in, but if you are in the US, for example, the US Postal Office has postal addresses where you can buy an address. So all you're buying is a box in the post office, but that box is it's like an address. In fact, it has a room, whatever, suite so and so, right? It gives this impression that it's some big fancy office. So that's one thing you can do. In your country, you can also you can ask your postal office. Most postal offices have that ability where you pay. People don't even send things via post now, so post offices are trying to make money one way or the other. That's one service they offer. So and it's pretty very, very cheap. It's not expensive. You can buy a postal box, which its actual address is like a suite, so that's how you can address that problem.
Okay, that's yet another one. How do we leverage getting clients while starting out as a beginner?
So when starting as a beginner, right? There are many ways you can do that. One is to let's say again, it depends on the industry, right? If let's say you want to do work delivering QA for quality assurance for new startups who are building tech products. What if I were starting a business today, let's say a tech, and I had no connection, what I would do is I'll go to Y Combinator and see all of the platforms they have or all of the platforms they've funded. So I know that these guys have money, right? They have received funding. I'll go to a platform they're doing, I will do high quality QA work and I'll send to them. No attachment. I'm just saying, hey, I reviewed your work, I reviewed your platform. Here are some bugs I found, right? Did that first time, it's like, wow, this is interesting. Do that second time. After a while, like, okay, hey, can we meet? Like there's almost no one in this world who will say no, I don't want to meet you, right? So that's how you need to start by delivering value or demonstrating like a large burden of proof that you can deliver value. It is then that anybody is willing to look at your side, especially if you're brand new, you have no experience. Yeah, you have to start by finding a way of delivering value. whatever that means in your own space. So that's the question you'll have to figure out.
Okay, thank you very much. It appears we have some answers. Well, maybe we'll take them first before coming to read the questions. Mr. Abate Jolie, please unmute and ask your question. Mr. Jolie, you can please ask your question.
All right, thank you very much for another session, Prof. My question is, one, if someone registers a company to offer service like research writing, maybe writing manuscript, actually doing the analysis, and they're just starting for the first time, what are the ways the person can go about it and it will not be overwhelming? Like you rightly said, writing can take a lot of time. So if you want to get a job that's all about writing and giving people work, how can we go about it so that the stress will not be much? And secondly, when registering a company, is there a minimum number of areas or activities that one should state while registering the company? Okay, this is what my company offers. Or is there a minimum number of things?
Okay, so good question. So for registration, you want to be a little bit broad so that you don't just say, oh, this is just I do write manuscripts. That's a bit too specific, right? The same considerations should go into your choice of name or your branding, right? Don't say, oh, so and so manuscript writing services. That's a bit too specific. What if you wake up tomorrow and say, oh, I want to pivot into a different area? Then now your name has become a big challenge because so you don't want to go down the line and then have to rebrand. So keep things as broad as possible. Now, for the first question about how do you avoid burnout? Well, you deploy automation where you can. The automation has to be your friend. So automate anything that you can automate. And if you can automate it, well, you have to hire people, right? At the beginning, you may not be able to hire people, but hopefully at some time, you should be able to find people. And this is where you get value from platforms like Fiverr, right? So you can look for, let's say, manuscript writing. Let me search that. So, I mean, you find different, different individuals, and some people have an approval by Fiverr's choice, for example. Of course, their rates are going to be quite different too. You can filter by the rating of the individual. So if you are just starting brand new and you have no resources, this could be helpful. But the problem obviously is that you don't know how good this person is. You may have to read the reviews clearly to see how good they are. There are also other platforms. A platform like Fiverr is not, people are not vetted before they come in. So there are other platforms that you could also explore, like TopTal. Those some of them are a bit more they're a bit more, people are vetted before they come in there. So this may be options to offset the load, but build automation, build systems, and where you can't, you can outsource. The freelancers initially, but then the goal is to eventually have a company, a team. Your most valuable asset is your team. So the long-term goal is to build a team. It can't be a one-man show or one-person show forever, right? Because that would mean, because the last thing you also want is to have a company where you are chained to the company. And if you're not there, there's no work done. That's the worst thing that could ever happen to you, right? You want to have some degree of independence so that whether you're there or not, the revenue is coming in. And that can only happen when you build systems and you build a team. And hopefully you build some automation as well.
Okay, thank you. Another question is from Chike. Kindly elaborate on how to access business domain.
Okay. So so there are two things you need here. You need a like the domain name. So there are two things. One, if you want to have your website, you need a domain name, and then you need hosting. Think of like, we're going to take the domain name, we're going to put it inside a pot, inside a container. This is where the website is, right? The website is hosted somewhere. It's not just floating in space. So the domain name here, you come in here and you search for your domain, the domain name you want. Let's say you want, so data hub, like let's go the data hub, or let's say small byte. Okay, smallbyte.ai. So here, you might say, okay, I like the name. In general, you want to avoid, there's some do's and don'ts in general about domain names. At minimum or at maximum, you want them to have 2 syllables, right? Like small bytes, that's 2 syllables. If it's not any longer, like I can't think of anything, then it's hard for people to remember it. You want names that are memorable, like small byte. That's a great name, right? It's like, oh, it sounds like bytes, but it's like a play on words where we're looking at bytes, that is data. And so that becomes, sorry, hold on a minute. So that becomes memorable. You also want to have, in general, case-sounding words are more memorable. Think of words like Coca-Cola, right? And that's why we went for the word Chisquares, because it has a case-sounding word. And so you come here, you would then add to your carts, and okay, it's taken. Okay, it's smallbyte.com. So you add to carts, and you can choose. There are different formulations here that you can choose. Smallbyte.io, .incorporated, or whatever. Right? You choose whichever you want, and they all have different prices. There are some that are really, really cheap. Generally, you want to avoid domain names that have a dash in the middle or something of that nature, because people will forget to put it, and then it's going to be a mistake. So it should just be continuous words like that. And then once you buy the domain, now one of the things that happens with some of these platforms is that when you come here and you search for a domain name and you don't buy it immediately, sometimes some of them are really, really bad faith actors. They take that domain name and then reserve it, and then you have to pay for it again. So if the domain name you want, you just buy it and you just go out, right? So once you buy the domain name, so let's say we want to add this to cart, and we check out. So you buy it, you check out, create an account as needed. Now that is yours. Now this is not a one-time, once and for all time. You have to keep paying for that domain every year. Now this comes with email service, so you can choose to connect this with your email service. It comes with some protection, or if you want to pay for those things. And then once you buy the domain name, then you can go and create your logo. You can go to Fiverr and have a logo created. There are a whole bunch of other AI logo creators too, if you want to. Or there are also other platforms that suggest names. So if you're trying to come up with a name, so you can also come up with AI name generator, right? There are quite a lot of them that. So let's look at this. So let's say the name is data. This is the list of should be the list of your concerns. Please don't spend forever and ever looking for a fancy name, right? That's where the list of your efforts should be going. But if you want a good name, you can say, well, it doesn't hurt to try. So you select the style of name you want, whether it's a brandable name or a short phrase or evocative name, or alternative spelling. And then it's going to suggest some things for you, and you can then choose to go with it or not. So these are some suggestions that's given. You can also do the same thing with logo creator, where but again, if you're serious about your business, at least you should be able to go and invest a few dollars in having a proper logo done. Even if you don't have a full-time designer in your company at that point, yeah, you can go to Fiverr and have some logo created for you. But that's essentially how you do that. And then on Fiverr also, see how I'm advertising. Please, I have no shares in Fiverr or anything of that nature. But it's great for people who are just starting because it's very, very low cost. You can also have your website created, right? You can find a designer who would create for you. Now, just to be very clear, the designer of a website is not the same thing as a developer, right? So in case you're thinking that the guy created a design for you, and so the website will just come to life. So you might need to understand that the design is quite different from the development. The design just say this is how it's going to look, and then it has to be developed. But you can also find people who will just, do it for you. You shouldn't worry about designing it. You can just use some templates, I mean, you don't need something fancy at the beginning. I hope that answers the question.
Okay. Another question from YouTube says, please share the name of the resource platform, both for services and when looking for clients.
Okay. We're going to put some resources together and just share to everybody at the end.
Okay, thank you for that. The next question says, Prof, at what point should patent of product or services come in? Is there a need for non-disclosure clauses?
Don't worry about that so much. Non-disclosure clauses come in the contract, right? So if you're now going to have a contract, you would have that. Obviously, if you also send a proposal to a company, you want to say that you want to put some language on restriction, right? Because the question is, what stops that company from reading your proposal and then say, oh, now let's go and implement it? So you put some language there that says, well, this document is purely for the sake of giving you a proposal, and yeah, the goal is not for you. Legally, you can't go and implement it, right? Because that's issues of intellectual property. But I wouldn't worry too much about those things. Don't worry so much about the legal issues at the beginning. At the very start, no, you don't have so much. Just worry about, how do I build a business? How do I find clients?
Thank you very much. Another one says, for someone with no knowledge in research, where should a person start from to build knowledge in research and business?
Well, if you have no knowledge in research, maybe you want to look for another business that is not a research business, but you want to build like a solid grasp of methodology and science and and the basics of research. If you're going to say, I'm going to offer my services as in research, of course, based on assumptions that you're an expert. So if you don't have sufficient depth in it, then that is not a business for you, because there has to be product founder fit, that the founder or the owner knows the full domain of the product or the service they're offering.
Okay, the next question is not related to what you just talked about. It says, do we have an update on when the tech epidemiology course is likely to start?
Yeah, we're working on that. We'll announce it as soon as it's, but that will be a terrific course to really immerse yourself in it, because it gives you a flair of both the science, but also the tech. Now, those two things are the killer combination you need in business, right? In the business of research, you need to know a bit about, not a bit, you need to know a lot about the technology aspect of it, in terms of like coding and technologies, and you also need to know the science. When you marry those two things together, great things happen.
Okay, next question says, Prof, what should inform your product or services name? Determining entity name and product name, should it be the same?
You can come up with, names like Google. What is Google? It doesn't mean anything. Don't worry so much about the product name. It can be anything. You give it life, right? It can take a meaningless name. You can call it Kaku, right? That's meaningless name. But a year later, you create a brand around it so much that people are like, wow, Kaku is so cool. So the name is meaningless. It can be anything. It doesn't matter really. And a brand is not a logo. A brand is what is the first thing that comes to people's mind when they hear of this product? That is your brand. It's not your logo. It's not a name like this. It's that work you put into it to create that first impression of that people think of the product when it comes to their mind. So I wouldn't worry about that at all.
Okay, another question here is, good evening, Prof. In a situation where you try to make friends a co-founder because you think they have the supportive skill, but just at the startup you realize they don't have it, then you decide to employ another person entirely who have the skill needed. Is it good enough? Also, how do you think the friends can be easily excused and discharged?
Well, there's no friends in business. Once you get in that realm of business, no longer friendship, right? Because businesses are bound by contracts and agreements and all manner of legal red tape. So you need to do your due diligence before you do all of that, not after. So the best cure here is prevention.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, the next question says, could you please explain again the difference between minimum viable and minimum lovable product?
Yeah. So MVP is just saying that, oh, it works. But that's very low bar. We live in an era where people have options, people have choice, right? So it's not enough to just come up with a product and say it works. No, but it's like there are three levels to meet people's sorry, hold on a minute. There are three levels to just a minute, please. You can there are three levels to meet people at in terms of delivering services. You can meet them at level of need, where the product just delivers the need and nothing more, right? But the highest level is the level of expectations, where things they did not even imagine are delivered and surpassed, right? So that's essentially where the distinction between an MVP and a minimum lovable product comes in. A minimum viable says, oh, it just does what it was designed to do. A minimum lovable says it just blows your mind. It goes way beyond just meeting the minimum requirement to exceeding that and and really creating a wow factor.
Okay, thank you very much. Another question says, can we create our own domain by ourselves? If so, how much time does it take?
No, you can't create a domain. You have to go and buy one, and then you register it, and then you build a website with that. Plus, why would you want to suffer if a service already exists to simplify that process?
Okay, thank you very much. Yet another question says, Prof, in which ways, if any, is a research business unique as compared to other forms of businesses?
It's not unique at all. There's no barrier to entry. So that means that anybody can wake up and everybody else is competition. And that's actually a terrible, terrible business where you can't build a defensive moat around the business where it's just, and so that's where, to make it really unique, that's where you have to be spectacular at what you do. Your skill sets and knowledge might distinguish you, but you have to figure out what other things make you special. What is it? Why will you command such a high fee for a work, right? Why would a client pay you $1 million for a project? Like, why? And so those are the things that you would have to figure out in terms of how you're going to sell, how you're going to differentiate yourself from competitors.
Okay, thank you very much, Prof. Our next question says, Prof, kindly elaborate on the different business models for research as service.
So there are different ways you can think about it, right? You can say, okay, B2B or B2C, business, B2B means business to business. So that means that you are delivering services primarily for businesses. My inbox is always completely overflowing with people like, oh, hey, we want to do, like want to do a research and like sometimes I don't have bandwidth to even respond to them, but because we don't deliver services to individuals, right? And so, but you could choose to say, oh, well, we deliver services for individuals. That's great. Just know that you're going to be spinning a lot of your wheels because they have very little money and a lot of problems. Or you can say, that yours is a B2C, which is business to corporations, or business to consumers, or business to businesses. Or it can be a hybrid of both. There's nothing saying that it can be only one of those. I have a meeting coming up, so I'll take the last question.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, if there's anyone.
Okay, I think these are the last questions. Questions they asked. Only someone else was complaining. He or she raised hand, but was not called. I think Kadiri, if your question has not been asked, please feel free to unmute and ask. Mr. Kadiri, now is your time for you to ask your question, please.
Okay.
Maybe it appears his or her question has been considered.
Already. Well, thanks everyone. So next week we'll just focus on some of the minimum skill sets that you would need for industry research. What are some of the common requirements in industry research, which is quite different from academic research? So that's what we're going to cover next week. Thanks everyone, and have a great weekend.
Thank you very much, Prof.
All right, thanks. Cheers.
Thanks everyone. We appreciate your time and all your questions. If you still have further questions, you could still take note of them. Maybe next week's session, you could still bring them forward. Thank you very much for your time. And the evaluation link has been forwarded. So if you have not filled the evaluation, please feel free to do that. Thank you so much, and enjoy the remaining part of the day.